In 1955, in a Dallas hospital, a woman pushed and panted until my brother's tiny head emerged between her legs, followed quickly by his slippery pink body. A minute and a half later, it was my turn to emerge, screaming. When you're an identical twin, birth is extremely antisocial. We got back together again quickly, for feeding and really for everything else. On our first Christmas, my father snapped a picture of us in identical pajamas sitting together in a laundry basket. When our third Easter rolled around, we were in identical black shorts, white shirts, and little bitty bow ties. I don't recall a me without a we. Our grandmother, peering at those photographs, couldn't guess who was who. On the back of the photo, my mother wrote Richard and Robert, but didn't indicate how to tell the difference. Our little sister Carolyn, 3 years younger than us and faced with our impenetrable closeness, didn't even try. She just called us the boys. In first grade, we were standing in a dusty yard of our grandmother's house in West Texas. One of us threw a hoe over the big pecan tree, and it crashed down on the skull of his brother, leaving a scar. And to this day, it isn't clear to me who threw the hoe and who it hit. I'm sure at the time that the hitter and hittee were well aware of their individual identities. But as time passed, people got it mixed up. And then we got confused. Now that we are both bald, a scar might tell us. But we are both scalp scar junkies. We spent our formative years running together through doorways that were too narrow, heads banging in unison against their frames, or crawling under church pews during interminable worship services, and finally working in attics where roofing nails reached down to leave bloody reminders that we were growing taller. At about that point in a boy's life, when saying toilet paper seems hysterical and fart jokes are all the rage, we realized that confusion could be entertaining. Being a twin in school means having a co-conspirator who thinks just like you do. No need to whisper in agreement when there's a substitute teacher. Later, when our social world included other boys, we could hatch more complex plots. One of us would switch places with our friend David. The substitute teacher, almost always young and insecure, would look at her seating chart and see two identical boys who were unrelated and two different boys who had the same name. They often didn't even ask until classroom giggling forced their hand. Back at home, there was nothing like slipping into the warm cocoon of shared imagination. We lay at night in our aptly named twin beds, turned off the lights, and entered the same small Gemini space capsule. Staring into the darkness, we narrated to each other our fantastic adventures in space until we fell asleep, our shared dreams carrying us to the moon or Mars or the galaxies beyond. It was great. Then it all ended. At a house on Bellucci Drive in Galveston. Just before 6th grade, we had moved. Our father became president of the junior college. His own dreams were no longer a fantasy. Things were changing. We were changing. Now we had separate bedrooms. Without Richard's voice in my ear, I couldn't be sure we had the same dreams. Now I would lie alone and listen to the radio at night, Casey Kasem's Top 40 stirring that potent mix of pre-adolescent hormones into a premonition of sexual desire, something which our Washpish family provided neither guidelines nor vocabulary. It was the first thing my twin and I didn't talk about. One day our pastor showed up at our classroom. I had been enjoying whatever I was feeling, and honestly I had no idea what I was feeling about a girl named Mitzi. She was reading a poem from A Gift of Watermelon Pickle. The pastor's appearance was an unpleasant shock, a purveyor of uneasy shame. He spoke to the teacher in a whisper. A moment later, we were climbing together into the soft back seat of his car. At home, we found our mother and sister in the living room. My mother's eyes were red. Her cheeks were stained with tears. I don't believe we had ever seen her cry. Without prelude, she told us that our father had died there on the sofa where she was sitting. There was no crying, only a wordless and final cutting away of the placenta as we retreated to our separate rooms. We were the men of the house, she said. We were 12 years old. The grief only hit me later, after the school year ended. We were on a bus tour to Richardson and a new home in a new city. The move to a new house was full of possibilities. I described one of them excitedly to my mother, ending with, "And then Dad can build." And I stopped. There was no Dad. My mother said, "I'm sure you and your brother can do it." I turned to the window and gazed out at the passing trees. I guess we would have to. My mother found a job as an elementary librarian. As we started Richardson Junior High, Richard and I had to work too, delivering newspapers, flipping burgers at Dairy Queen, fixing up the house, of which we were the men. Sort of men. I remember that Amy giggled when Richard plucked a piece of popcorn from her lap. They were in the back seat of the car behind Cindy and I. As we entered high school, it was our fate to double date. Our car was a Buick convertible, cobalt blue, 2 bench seats, shift lever on the steering column. Cindy was my date, Amy was her best friend. Girls thought it was cute to date twins, so it seems they always came in pairs. It could work to our advantage, I admit it. We learned about girls. It was slow at first. Sitting in a dark car with Cindy and Amy was like finding ourselves staring at the instrument panel of a real Gemini spacecraft. We were in separate seats instead of separate beds, but cocooned in metal with these girls, it was still a fantasy, which leads to newbie mistakes. I spent an excruciating hour and a half in a drive-in watching Lost Horizon, thinking I was provocatively stroking Cindy's arm. The rub marks on her vital handbag never came out. Then there came the end of double dates. Richard and I broke up after high school. We went to separate universities. We found our own friends. I learned what it was like to be part of a pack instead of being one of a pair. In the photos, it gets easier and easier to tell us apart. And we drifted apart. I married, became a missionary, and moved to my wife's home country of Malaysia, starting a foreign sojourn of 20 years. Richard became a lawyer and stayed in Dallas. He did well. I like to think I did some good. Yet it is still there. The pulsing blood, the ravel and unravel of the DNA. In 1989, when I awakened to a ringing phone call in Kuala Lumpur and heard my own voice on the line, I knew my mother was dying before the words passed his lips. Not so many years later, I said, "It's okay," even before he told me of his divorce. And when, during a tense, poor summer years later, I needed a loan, he had written the check before I even asked. We didn't exchange many words. We didn't need to externalize our intimacy. We were there for each other, whether in the same room or half a world away. 30 years ago, my 9-month-old daughter first saw her uncle, reached for him and fearlessly hugged his neck, then reached back to me, then reached for him. A delightful confusion. 20 years later, his adopted daughter reached out for me and fearlessly held my neck, then reached back to him, then reached back and hugged me. We were never just two halves of a whole. I think we were always twice as much.